Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're talking about the fundamental infrastructure of any functioning democracy. And I don't mean the buildings or the legal codes, but something. Well, something invisible. The bonds of trust and cooperation that exist between citizens.
Exactly. And this is such a crucial area of study for political behavior because we're really examining the fundamental health of a society. Why do some communities solve problems so easily and others just seem paralyzed by suspicion?
Right. Or why do citizens accept government authority in one place, but, deeply distrust it in another? That sounds incredibly important and maybe a little abstract. So our mission today is to make that abstraction really concrete. We're diving deep into the concept of social capital, what creates it, what destroys it, and why its presence or absence really dictates how we all view our governing institutions. And for you, the listener, you're going to walk away with a shortcut to understanding some of the biggest societal trends of the last 50 years.
To guide this deep dive, we're synthesizing insights from several really monumental studies in political science. Our exploration is built around three core sources.
Okay.
First, there is the 1997 article, Individual-Level Evidence for the Causes and Consequences of Social Capital by John Brehm and Wendy Rahn. Then there's Robert Putnam's seminal 1995 essay, Tuning In, Tuning Out, The Strange Disappearance of Social Capital in America.
The famous one.
The famous one. And finally, the 2010 update to that, which is called Still Bowling Alone, The Post-9/11 Split by Thomas Sander and Robert Putnam.
Okay, so before we get into the heavy data, we have to define our core concept. When we say social capital, what are we actually trying to measure?
At its heart, social capital, and this is coming from thinkers like James Coleman and Robert Putnam, is that dense web of cooperative relationships, networks, norms, and shared trust that exists among citizens.
Okay.
Think of it as a resource. Its practical utility is that it drastically lowers the sort of transaction costs you need to resolve these complex collective action problems.
Meaning, if I trust you, it's just much easier to coordinate on things.
Yeah.
Like a neighborhood watch or a volunteer fire department, or even agreeing to abide by some difficult environmental regulations. I'm just more confident you won't, cheat.
Precisely. If you believe your neighbors and your fellow citizens are operating in good faith, you're dramatically more likely to invest your own resources, your time, your money, your effort into cooperative stuff. And historically, social capital was seen as a property of communities.
Right, like an aggregate feature, like a city's population density or so on.
Exactly. But the work by Brehm and Rahn that we'll start with, it shifts the focus entirely. They look at how this concept really manifests at the individual level.
So it's not just about the town, it's about the person.
It's about the person. They see it as a tight, measurable dynamic within the behavior and attitudes of citizens themselves.
Okay, let's unpack that core structure then, drawing mainly from Brehm and Rahn's 1997 analysis. They set out to specify social capital at that individual level, arguing it revolves around a reciprocal relationship between two measurable components. What are those foundational pillars? What defines an individual's stock of social capital?
The two foundational pillars are civic engagement and interpersonal trust.
Okay.
They hypothesize that these two components, they feed into each other in this positive feedback loop, what they call the virtuous circle. And their goal was to use this massive data set, the General Social Survey, which ran from 1972 to 1994, to actually test and quantify that relationship.
So let's get into how they measured these, pretty abstract concepts. Starting with civic engagement. This is the doing side, right? The participation. How do they quantify how much someone joins?
Civic engagement was measured through participation in a really wide array of organizations. They meticulously counted memberships across 16 different types of groups.
Yeah.
16, yeah. It included everything from, fraternal organizations like the Masons or the Elks to service clubs like Rotary or Kiwanis, political clubs, sports leagues, church-affiliated groups, professional societies.
The whole gamut.
The whole gamut. The idea was to capture a really comprehensive picture of community interaction outside of your immediate family or your workplace.
And did the data suggest that all these forms of membership were sort of equal representations of a voluntary civic spirit?
Almost. But they noted one really significant exception, labor union membership. It had what they called a conspicuously small factor loading.
Okay, so for those of us not deep in statistics, what does that mean in plain English?
It just means that being in a union was less reflective of that general underlying trait of civic engagement than, say, joining the Parent-Teacher Association or a church group.
And why would that be?
Well, the researchers suggest it's likely because in a lot of states, and for a lot of jobs, union membership can be compulsory. It can be a mandatory requirement for employment.
Ah, so if you're forced to join, it doesn't really say anything about your desire to be an engaged citizen.
Exactly. It doesn't represent the same voluntary expression of civic inclination as, choosing to join a literary society or a service club. So they correctly flagged that not all memberships are created equal when you're trying to measure social commitment.
That's a fascinating distinction. Okay, now let's move to the believing side. Interpersonal trust. How in the world did they measure something as general as trust in other people?
They used three core questions designed to capture a sort of global sense of the benevolence of human nature.
Okay.
These questions asked respondents to choose. So, do most people try to be fair, or do they try to take advantage?
Mm-hmm.
Are they helpful, or are they mostly just looking out for themselves? And generally speaking, can most people be trusted, or can't you be too careful?
So it's really getting at your baseline optimism about your fellow citizen.
That's the goal.
Okay, so we have the cooperative actions, the joining and the cooperative attitudes, the trusting. They expected this virtuous circle where joining boosts trust and trust boosts joining. Did the data confirm that reciprocity?
It absolutely confirmed the positive reciprocal relationship. The more people participated in local life, the more trusting they became. The more trusting they were, the more likely they were to go out and participate.
So the virtuous circle is real.
The virtuous circle is real, but, and this is the crucial analytical nugget, the relationship is profoundly asymmetric.
Okay, let's dive into that asymmetry. This is where the real political behavior insight is, right?
This is it.
Which direction was stronger?
The flow of causality from civic engagement to interpersonal trust was the dominant driver.
Wait, so participation influences trust far more than trust influences participation?
Far more. Quantitatively, the effect of participation on trust was about 4 times stronger than the reverse. It was, in fact, one of the most powerful relationships they found in their entire structural model.
That is so counterintuitive.
Yeah.
I think we all assume that being skeptical stops us from joining things.
Right.
But this suggests that even if you start out skeptical, the simple act of showing up and working with people is a much better cure for that skepticism than having a sunny attitude is for getting you off the couch.
That is precisely the implication. The act of participation, it provides these repeated, low-stakes, positive interactions. You discover through experience that the person running the bake sale isn't trying to cheat you,
Wow.
and that the person coaching the soccer team is, generally helpful. These repeated experiences are just more efficient at altering your generalized belief system than a pre-existing optimistic attitude is at overcoming the inertia it takes to join a group.
So for any community leader or policymaker trying to reverse this decline in social capital, the takeaway is crystal clear.
What's that?
Focus on generating opportunities for people to do things together. Even if you have to subsidize it or incentivize it, the trust will follow the engagement.
It's the difference between trying to change attitudes abstractly and changing them through shared experience. It really suggests participation is the engine room and trust is the beneficial output.
Okay, so now let's look at the factors outside of this loop. What are the exogenous causes, the predictable demographic and socioeconomic factors that drive people to be more civically engaged in the first place?
Well, the longstanding literature was pretty much confirmed. Resources matter a lot.
Okay.
Education, which represents cognitive abilities and sort of organizational resources, had the strongest positive effect by a wide margin. Following that was real family income and, to a lesser extent, political partisanship.
Because parties can be organizing vehicles.
Exactly.
Education is almost always the strongest predictor for these things. Did Brehm and Rahn offer a way to put the economic factor into perspective?
They did a very clever comparison. They found that a $1,000 increase in real family income had roughly the same positive effect on participation as a year and a half of additional education.
Wow. So while education is key, you really can't underestimate the practical advantage of just having more economic stability. It gives you the time and means to get involved.
That's right.
And what about the other side of the coin? What were the major drains, the opportunity costs that pulled people away from engagement?
The biggest drains were all about how people spend their non-work time. They identified 2 key negative factors.
Okay.
First, having an additional preschool child, which is an obvious drain on parental time. And second, the far more subtle but profound effect of television viewing. Each additional hour of TV consumption per night significantly reduced participation.
We're definitely coming back to television as a suspect later, but just based on this early data, how serious of a drain was it compared to other factors?
It was characterized as a serious, debilitating drain on the civic side of social capital. An hour of television viewing was found to be statistically equivalent in its negative effect to a pretty significant change in income or a drop in your educational attainment.
That's powerful. It's a behavioral choice that just eats up the one resource you need for engagement, your time.
Your time.
Okay, that's a powerful correlation.
Yeah.
Let's switch to the exogenous causes of interpersonal trust. What factors shape our generalized belief that people are good, outside of actually joining groups?
This list is really revealing. It tells you a lot about the emotional and experiential inputs into trust. The single factor that was most strongly related to trust was life satisfaction.
So, happy people are more trusting.
Significantly more. People who reported being generally happier and more satisfied with their lives were much more trusting of others. The researchers hypothesized that Americans tend to sort of transfer their internal mood onto their judgment of the world.
So happiness casts this trusting glow on everything.
It seems so.
That's a huge psychological mechanism tied to a major political variable. What about the socioeconomic predictors of trust?
Similar to engagement, higher education and real family income both lead to more generalized trust. And conversely, negative experiences severely undermine it.
For example,
Well, they found that being black showed a strong negative correlation with generalized trust. And the researchers are very careful here to interpret this not as some inherent trait, but as a likely reflection of real-world experiences with systemic discrimination or social insularity.
which would naturally foster a more cautious, less trusting outlook.
Of course. And on top of that, personal victimization, so fear of crime or having been burglarized, that also diminished trust. When your personal security is violated, your faith in the general benevolence of society just plummets.
And finally, what about the effect of the broader community? Can the economic health of my neighborhood undermine my personal belief in other people?
Absolutely. And this is crucial for linking individual behavior back to the aggregate world. They found that community characteristics mattered. High income inequality, measured specifically by the GNI index, and high unemployment levels in an area were both found to diminish individual levels of interpersonal trust.
So if resources are visibly scarce or unequally distributed, it just fosters suspicion and anxiety.
And makes individuals less likely to view others as fair or helpful. Yes.
So we understand the core engine. Engagement drives trust, and trust is built on security and life satisfaction. Now we connect the social capital structure to the highest level of political stability, its effect on confidence in government. Brehm and Rahn focused on confidence in the major federal institutions, the executive branch, Congress, and the Supreme Court.
The findings here reveal that social capital is just inextricably linked to system support, but the dynamics are, well, they're complex and even a bit contradictory.
Okay, let's start with interpersonal trust.
They're right. Trust in your fellow citizens had a highly significant positive effect on confidence in federal institutions.
Why does trusting my next-door neighbor translate into confidence in the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court?
It's rooted in a really fundamental psychological mechanism. If you are a misanthrope, someone who generally doubts the good intentions of the average person, you find it extremely hard to accept the decisions and actions of those in authority.
You're always suspicious.
You constantly suspect foul play. You believe that rules are being made to exploit you because you fundamentally believe people are cheats.
So the critical implication here is that just improving government performance on its own, it might not be enough.
It may be insufficient to restore system confidence if the baseline of interpersonal trust among citizens is already low. If society is riddled with suspicion, no amount of technical competence from Washington is going to convince the public that the government isn't fundamentally working against them.
That puts an incredible burden on social cohesion. Wow. Okay, now let's look at the other pillar, civic engagement. Logically, you'd think that someone who is highly engaged in their community would also be a big supporter of strong federal institutions.
You would think so.
But the findings suggested the opposite, right?
They found a negative correlation. Increased civic engagement actually accompanied lesser confidence in federal government institutions.
That seems so backwards to a modern observer.
It does, but it aligns perfectly with classical political theory, specifically Alexis de Tocqueville's observations from the 19th century.
The art of association hypothesis. How does that translate here?
Tocqueville observed that local association, joining things, it teaches citizens how to solve their own problems without relying on the state. It combats what he called centralizing tendencies. People who are highly engaged in community self-help, running the local school board, fixing the local park, managing the community garden, they're just less reliant on Washington for their needs. They're self-sufficient.
So the most civically active people locally are also the ones who feel the least inherent need for the federal government. And that translates to a slight reduction in their expressed confidence in those institutions.
Exactly. It's not that they distrust the government so much as they don't need it constantly. Their political capital comes from local sources, not national ones.
So there's this tension. Trust in people boosts system confidence, but engagement in local groups slightly reduces it.
That's the tension.
This leads us to what you called the most profound linkage in the entire model, the government's own role in influencing social capital. What did they find about the reverse causal flow confidence in government influencing interpersonal trust?
This is the finding that should stop any political behavior expert in their tracks. The effect of confidence in government upon interpersonal trust is absolutely massive. It dwarfs every other causal link in the model.
Every other one.
By a large margin. This relationship was the single largest estimate in the entire structural analysis.
Wait. So institutional confidence is the single strongest predictor of whether I trust my neighbor.
Yes. And this powerfully confirms Margaret Levi's conjecture that institutions can influence generalized trust. If the government is performing well, if the courts seem fair, if Congress is functional, if the executive branch is seen as competent, it provides citizens with a strong sense of security.
It's like a safety net.
It's a safety net. It gives them reassurance that defectors, cheats, and exploiters will be detected and punished.
So good government reinforces the belief that society is generally benevolent.
Precisely. If the system works, the average citizen doesn't have to spend all their time worrying that they'll be taken advantage of, and that allows their underlying trust levels to rise.
But that's a double-edged sword.
A huge one. Good institutional performance can jumpstart the virtuous circle by injecting trust from the top down. But if government performance is poor or institutions fail, that breakdown can initiate a massive downward spiral.
And that spiral sounds deadly. Poor government undermines confidence, which severely undermines interpersonal trust, which then slows participation, which leads to more suspicion and...
Yeah. It's a crisis accelerator. It connects political stability directly back to the health of the citizenry. The findings are a critical reminder that while citizens may complain about federal institutions, the performance of those institutions is a defining factor in how people view each other.
And we should briefly note, Brehm and Rahn did confirm that the traditional explanations for confidence still matter. What were the standard predictors that remained solid?
Well, economic factors were confirmed. Both the pocketbook considerations, so how your personal finances are changing, and the sociotropic ones like the aggregate economy, unemployment, inflation, they all affect confidence.
When the economy feels healthy, confidence rises.
Right. And we also see the confirmation of that life satisfaction link again. Unhappy Americans tend to transfer their personal dissatisfaction onto federal institutions, regardless of their ideology or who the president is.
So if you're generally miserable, you're more likely to project that misery onto Washington.
Seems so. And then there was that interesting paradox about wealth.
Right. What was that again?
Wealthier respondents were generally less confident in federal institutions, maybe because they're more engaged locally, like Tocqueville said. Yet, individuals who reported an improving financial status were significantly more confident.
So it's the momentum. The trajectory matters more than just the static level of wealth when you're talking about system support.
That's a great way to put it.
And that really sets the stage for the enormous puzzle that motivated all of this research in the first place. The alarming trend of shrinking social capital that Robert Putnam documented in the 90s. Let's shift our focus to Putnam's 1995 essay, Tuning In, Tuning Out, and the mystery of what he called the Great Retreat.
Putnam meticulously showed that America's stock of social capital began shrinking around the 1960s and 70s, and it just accelerated into the 1980s. This was not anecdotal. The data showed dramatic, pervasive retreats across virtually all indicators of civic life.
What were some of the most striking numbers? I mean, beyond the famous image of people bowling alone.
The figures were jarring. Conventional voluntary association participation, things like the Parent-Teacher Association, the Elks Club, the League of Women Voters, labor unions, they showed membership declines ranging from 25% to 50%.
Wow, 50%.
The organizational infrastructure of American community life was visibly hollowed out, and time budget studies reinforce this. They showed a decline in the actual time people spent interacting.
Oh.
Time spent on clubs and organizations was down by roughly half between 1965 and 1985. Time spent on informal socializing, just visiting friends, was also down significantly, maybe by a quarter. This was real disengagement.
And did this extend into formal political participation, too?
Absolutely. Collective political participation saw sharp falls. For example, attending a rally or a speech dropped by 36% between 1973 and 1993.
And what about working for a political party?
Off by a staggering 56% in that same period. The General Social Survey confirmed the trend globally. A roughly one-quarter drop in group membership since '74, and perhaps most distressingly, a drop of about one-third in generalized social trust since 1972.
That is pervasive society-wide shift. But this brings us to the core mystery that makes this whole thing so baffling. The education paradox.
The education paradox is the investigative hinge of the entire study. Remember, education is the single strongest predictor of engagement and trust. And educational attainment in America rose massively throughout this period. Americans were, on average, way more educated in 1990 than they were in 1970.
So based purely on rising educational levels, social capital should have soared.
Correct. Putnam calculated that the rise in educational attainment since 1972 should have produced a 15 to 20% increase in social capital.
But instead,
the country witnessed a 15 to 25% decline.
that means the forces causing the erosion were so powerful that they didn't just counteract the positive boost from education, they completely overwhelmed it. We're looking for something massive, something that affected all parts of society.
A pervasive force that cut across all educational and economic strata.
So when you're faced with a decline of this magnitude, something that goes against all the demographic expectations, Putnam and his colleagues had to rigorously eliminate the most common suspects. Let's run through that alibi check,
This is key.
because these counterintuitive findings are what point to the real culprit.
Right. The public conversation always points fingers at a few usual suspects. First, busyness and time pressure. The story is that modern life is just too hectic, people are too stressed, and they just don't have the time for the Elks Club anymore.
And did the time budget studies confirm that Americans have less free time now than in 1965?
Surprisingly, the evidence largely exonerates busyness. The time budget studies actually suggest Americans gained free time between 1965 and 1985.
Gained.
We might feel rushed, but the objective data doesn't support a massive loss of leisure time. And here's the kicker. Individual correlation studies show that people who reported long hours on the job were correlated with more civic engagement, not less.
Wait. The workaholics are the joiners?
They are. People who work longer hours tend to forego privatized, leisure-like watching TV, but they actively maintain their organizational activity. They'll skip the TV show, but they prioritize the Kiwanis meeting.
So busyness is not the excuse.
No. The slump affected full-time workers, part-time workers, and non-employed people all the same, proving that the simple amount of time available wasn't the main issue.
Okay, next suspect. Economic hardship. Given the turbulent 70s and 80s, was the erosion concentrated among the financially struggling?
Again, the data provides an alibi that surprises a lot of people. While it's true that lower-income people are generally less engaged than affluent people, the decline in trust and engagement was visible at all income levels.
All of them.
In fact, the decline was found to be slightly greater among the more affluent segments of the American public.
That is deeply counterintuitive. Why would the people with the most resources and stability show the steepest decline in civic engagement?
Well, one hypothesis is that the high-status voluntary organizations, which often rely on those well-educated affluent members, were just disproportionately affected by whatever cultural forces caused the slump. But regardless of the reason, economic hardship was ruled out as the primary cause.
Okay, let's talk about residential mobility and suburbanization.
Yeah.
The idea that we all move around too much to put down roots.
This one is unequivocally cleared by census data. Rates of residential mobility have been remarkably constant or even slightly declining over the last half-century. Americans are not fundamentally less rooted than they were decades ago.
And the move to the suburbs, doesn't that sort of lack of density reduce community feeling?
It seems like it should, but suburbanization is also ruled out as the primary engine of decline. The key finding is that the downtrends in trusting and joining were virtually identical everywhere.
Everywhere.
Big cities, small towns, suburbs, rural areas. Moving to a new type of place didn't cause the decline because the decline happened regardless of what kind of place you're in.
We have to address one of the greatest sociological changes of the 20th century, the changing role of women. The theory being that when women entered the paid labor force, the volunteer core of civil society just vanished.
This is a highly plausible theory, but the evidence is complex, and ultimately it's just not enough to carry the weight of this massive decline.
How so?
While women did bear a disproportionate share of the decline in engagement, the data doesn't tie this directly to workforce entry. In fact, working women are often members of more voluntary associations than housewives. More, though the types of groups they join differ. And most damningly, the overall declines in engagement were actually somewhat greater among housewives than among employed women.
So women entering the workforce is more of a side effect of a broader shift, not the cause of the slump itself.
That's how the research frames it.
What about the disruption of marriage and family ties? The rising divorce rates?
The disintegration of marriage is a significant, modest accessory, but it's not the main villain. Unmarried people are indeed less trusting and engaged than married people. So, yes, the loosening of family bonds contributes. But the magnitude of the civic decline remains substantial, even among the happily married. Like women's workforce entry, it contributes, but it just doesn't explain the universal retreat.
Okay, last two. The institutional suspects. The growth of the welfare state and the civil rights revolution. Did big government crowd out civil society, or did desegregation lead to a kind of sociological white flight?
Starting with the welfare state, Putnam found that state-level differences in social capital were totally uncorrelated with welfare spending or government size.
Uncorrelated.
In fact, cross-national data showed that social capital was, if anything, positively correlated with the size of the state. This completely contradicts the crowding out argument.
And the race factor.
The civil rights revolution is also very difficult to pin the blame on. The erosion of social capital affected all races in a similar way, and the decline was often faster among Black Americans in the 1980s than among white Americans. And, what's more, the pace of disengagement among white citizens was uncorrelated with their level of racial intolerance.
So racist individuals weren't dropping out of community life any faster than more tolerant people.
Exactly. The data is just inconsistent with the theory that white flight from newly integrated civic life caused the overall decline.
This is a genuine mystery. We've eliminated time, money, location, marital status, major institutional shifts, all as primary causes for a decline that affected everyone, everywhere. The only variable that consistently predicts civic health, second only to education, is age. Older people are more engaged and trusting.
And this brings us to the crucial investigative breakthrough, the age paradox. If older people are more engaged, the natural assumption is the life cycle effect.
Right. As you age, you settle down, buy a house, have kids, you naturally get more involved.
That's the assumption. But the data prove that the baby boomers, for example, did not generally become more engaged or trusting as they aged from their 20s into their 40s during that 1972 to 1994 period.
They didn't.
No. The General Social Survey showed virtually no evidence of individuals becoming more engaged or trusting as they got older. Most cohorts' levels of trust either fell or just stayed flat, reflecting the overall period decline.
So if people aren't becoming more trusting as they age, why are older people consistently more trusting and engaged than younger people?
The resolution is that the differences represent powerful, long-term generational effects. Successive generations are enduringly imprinted with different outlooks during their formative years.
So the critical question isn't how old you are now.
It's when you came of age.
Right.
Putnam identified the long civic generation as the key cohort, those born roughly between 1910 and 1940. This generation, they came of age during the Depression, World War II, the post-war boom. They set the high watermark for social capital, and they were the last cohort raised without a specific technological disruption.
And how stark is the difference between them and the generations that followed?
The difference is profound. Compared to those born in the late 1960s, long civic generation members belong to almost twice as many civic associations.
Twice as many.
They're twice as likely to express generalized trust in others, and they vote at almost double the rate. Every subsequent generation that reached adulthood since the 1940s has been progressively less trusting and less engaged than its predecessor.
It's like, as he put it, the post-war generations were exposed to a mysterious X-ray during their adolescence that made them less likely to connect.
That's the metaphor.
Okay, so we've reformulated the puzzle.
Right.
What major pervasive cultural factor emerged rapidly in the 1940s and 50s that could have acted as this pervasive anti-civic X-ray, imprinting successive generations?
And the conclusion is that there is only one prominent suspect that fits the timing, the cross-cutting pervasiveness, and the behavioral effect: television.
Let's look at the evidence against television. You mentioned timing. How quickly did it penetrate society?
The diffusion was astonishingly fast. Barely 10% of American homes had a TV set in 1950. By 1959, it was 90%. Viewing hours also grew over the subsequent decades, with the average American watching significantly more TV by the 1980s. This rapid, cross-cutting cultural saturation coincided precisely with the generations showing that profound civic disengagement.
And what's the direct statistical link between viewing habits and social capital scores?
It's damning. Television viewing is strongly and negatively related to both social trust and group membership, even when you control for every other demographic factor we've discussed: education, income, age, race, gender. It's an independent civic inhibitor.
And you mentioned print media has the opposite effect.
Exactly. Consumption of print media, specifically newspaper reading, is positively correlated with both trust and engagement.
So did the data allow for a direct comparison
Right.
between the heavy consumers of these two different media?
It did. The researchers compared pure readers, those with low TV consumption and high newspaper reading, with pure viewers. And the difference was staggering. The pure readers belonged to 76% more civic organizations and were 55% more trusting than the pure viewers, even after controlling for education.
So why? Why does television destroy social capital? What are the mechanisms of destruction that make the viewer a loner and a misanthrope?
There are two main pathways. The first is time displacement. Television watching is just highly effective at privatizing leisure time.
Uh-huh.
Unlike listening to the radio or many other hobbies, watching TV is passive, it's solitary, and it discourages participation outside the home. It just sucks up the time that might otherwise have been spent at a local meeting or volunteering or simply visiting a neighbor.
And the second mechanism?
And the second is the effects on outlooks, often described as the mean world effect. Heavy television watchers are exposed to these highly stylized, often violent and suspicious portrayals of human interaction. So they become unusually skeptical about the benevolence of other people. They may overestimate crime rates, they project negative intentions, and they generally internalize a deeply pessimistic view of human nature.
Which directly undermines generalized interpersonal trust.
Exactly.
So it's the perfect anti-civic weapon. It makes you stay home, and it convinces you that the world outside isn't worth engaging with anyway.
That's a perfect summary. Putnam estimated that the adoption of television might directly account for as much as 1/4 to 1/2 of the total observed drop in social capital. This single technological innovation fundamentally changed the cultural climate for generations.
But the story of social capital doesn't end there with the triumph of the television. If we fast forward 15 years from Putnam's initial essay to the 2010 update by Sander and Putnam, did the trends continue, or was there any sign of a civic reversal?
The picture became much more complex. It introduced signs of hope, especially among young people. Even back in the late 90s, there was an observation of an increase in youth volunteering.
Right, even if it was driven by things like college admissions requirements.
Right, but it showed that engagement could be stimulated.
Then came the national crisis of 9/11. How did that galvanizing event impact the trajectory of the youngest generations?
The events of September 11th, 2001, acted as a shock to the system, and it seemed to strengthen the civic conscience of young people, particularly those who were in their impressionable adolescent years.
And this was different from the effect on older adults.
It was. For older adults, the spike in community-mindedness and generalized trust was pretty short-lived. It faded quickly. But for the young, the shift appeared more lasting. It was potentially signaling a reversal of that negative generational effect.
And what evidence supports this rise in the post-9/11 generation?
We saw clear evidence in political engagement. College freshmen interest in politics, which had fallen to an historic low of 16% discussing politics in 2000, more than doubled after 2001. It reached an all-time high of 36%.
That's a huge jump.
A huge jump. And voting rates rose significantly faster for young Americans. Between 2000 and 2008, voting rates rose more than 3 times faster for Americans under 29 than for those over 30. Decades of youthful political disinterest seem to be reversing.
That is genuinely hopeful. But the 2010 update revealed that this resurgence was not uniform. It introduced a critical new problem. What was the ominous split that emerged?
The overall rise in youth engagement was masking a growing civic and social gap based on socioeconomic class. The new generation of joiners was bifurcated based on their parents' resources and education.
Okay, so how exactly did this class gap manifest among, say, high school seniors?
Sander and Putnam analyzed high school seniors based on parental education. And over the preceding 30 years, upper-middle-class white seniors, those with parents holding postgraduate education, steadily deepened their engagement.
In what ways?
They were increasingly likely to participate in church, spend meaningful time connecting with their parents, participate in organized sports. Their social capital was robust, and it was growing.
And what about the less affluent segment of the population?
The exact opposite occurred for working or lower-class white high school seniors whose parents hadn't gone beyond high school. They were increasingly withdrawing, they deserted church pews, their organized activities declined sharply, and they spent far more time alone.
And what about the trust component?
The gap in interpersonal trust is particularly stark. Among the have-not seniors, generalized trust in others just plummeted, continuing that generational decline. But seniors from better-off families showed essentially no decline in social trust.
So the resources and stability of the affluent seemed to buffer them against the anxieties and suspicions that afflicted the working-class youth.
It seems so. The civic divergence is based primarily on class, even while the overall black-white gap in engagement remains a separate, ongoing issue.
So it creates this scenario where you have two Americas emerging among the youth. One with robust social capital, resources trust, actively engaging, and one that's increasingly isolated, distrusting, and withdrawn.
That's the concern.
Now, the 2010 update was published after the emergence of major social networking sites like Facebook and Twitter. Did the authors conclude that these new technologies would replace traditional social capital?
They maintained a sort of necessary agnosticism. These sites emerged after the initial post-9/11 upturn, so they weren't the cause of the renewed interest.
Right.
However, they did acknowledge that these tools were being used adroitly. For example, the Obama campaign successfully deployed social media alongside classic face-to-face organizing techniques.
But the big question remains.
The key question is unresolved: whether online behavior can truly produce the kind of deep, durable, and enduring civic effects that truly replace those foundational face-to-face social ties. The time displacement effect of digital media might just be the new television.
But that remains to be seen.
It does.
This has been a deeply insightful and, I have to say, often sobering deep dive into the architecture of modern political behavior. We've learned that the health of our political system, it's not just about ballots and policy. It relies so heavily on the quality of the bonds between citizens.
To synthesize the core findings, social capital is critical for system support. It operates primarily as an asymmetric reciprocal loop where action engagement is the most efficient driver of attitude trust. And its collapse over the last half-century is overwhelmingly a generational phenomenon, traceable largely to the isolating and outlook-shaping effect of television consumption.
And most critically, our recent data shows this ominous tension. While the post-9/11 generation proved that civic enthusiasm can be galvanized by collective experience, this progress masks a rapidly growing civic cleavage based on class. Affluent young people are deepening their engagement, while less affluent young people are withdrawing into isolation and distrust.
And this leads us to our final provocative thought for you to consider. The research we reviewed consistently links high social capital to effective political institutions, robust collective well-being, economic development, and low crime rates. So if the have-not segment of the rising generation increasingly lacks this core foundation of trust and engagement, what are the inevitable long-term costs of this growing civic cleavage for the political stability and social cohesion of the entire society?
If that basic shared resource of trust begins to fracture along socioeconomic lines, the implications for addressing future national crises, from economic downturns to climate challenges, they become almost insurmountable.
It's an essential question for anyone contemplating the future of democracy. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.